The afternoon sun, filtered through the towering marble columns of the Supreme Court building, cast long shadows across the polished floor. Ezekiel Monroe stood patiently in the East Corridor, a figure of quiet dignity. His tailored suit, dark as a moonless night, hung impeccably on his frame, a testament to years of carrying the weight of justice. He adjusted his cufflinks, a small, almost unconscious gesture, the faint clinking of metal against metal barely audible in the hushed hallway. He wasn't accustomed to waiting. His time, even in retirement, was meticulously allocated, each moment a precious commodity. But today he was content to stand, to let the familiar solemnity of the building seep into him, a reminder of the oaths sworn and the battles fought within these hallowed walls. His name, once spoken aloud in courtrooms across the nation, now echoed only in hushed tones, a legend whispered in legal circles. A ripple of anticipation, almost imperceptible, coursed through him. He was here for a private ceremony, a quiet acknowledgement of his contribution to the tapestry of American law, a small, private victory in a lifetime dedicated to the pursuit of justice. A heavy tread broke the stillness. Monroe turned, his eyes, sharp and discerning despite the passage of time, settling on the approaching figure. A young officer, his uniform crisp and new, his posture rigid, stopped a few feet away. Officer Travis Miller, his name tag proclaimed. Monroe registered the name, filing it away in his mental catalog, his mind already calculating the nuances of the impending interaction. There was a stiffness in the young officer's stance, a tension in his jaw that hinted at something beyond the usual formality. Monroe felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a premonition of the unwelcome discourse that too often punctuated his daily life. "Excuse me, sir. Can I see your ID?" Miller's voice was sharper than necessary, echoing in the vast corridor, shattering the quiet dignity of the moment. The words hung in the air, laced with an undercurrent that Monroe recognized instantly. He'd heard it before, felt it directed at him, a subtle yet undeniable challenge to his presence, his belonging. Internally, Monroe sighed, a deep, weary exhale of air that he didn't allow to escape his lips. He'd hoped to avoid this tiresome ritual of proving his worth within the very institution he had served for decades. He reached into his breast pocket, his movements deliberate, unhurried, retrieving his identification. He presented it to the officer, the small, rectangular card gleaming under the muted light, the embossed letters proclaiming his name and former title, Justice Ezekiel Monroe. A title that should have spoken volumes, that should have rendered this entire interaction unnecessary. Miller took the ID, his fingers brushing against Monroe's. The contact, brief and impersonal, felt charged with an unspoken tension. Miller scrutinized the card, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, each tick of the unseen clock amplifying the absurdity of the situation. Monroe observed him, his gaze steady, unwavering. He saw the uncertainty flicker in the young officer's eyes, the subtle shift in his stance, a subtle tightening of his grip on the ID card. This young man, Monroe surmised, was grappling with a conflict, a dissonance between the image before him, a distinguished black man in a tailored suit, and the preconceived notions that clouded his judgment. A young female officer, Officer Hannah Beck, her name tag revealed, appeared beside Miller. She glanced at the ID, then at Monroe, her eyes widening slightly. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even respect, crossed her face. But it was quickly replaced by a mask of professional neutrality. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a subtle sign of her discomfort. Monroe noted her unease, the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted her cap. She was caught, he realized, in the crosshairs of duty and conscience. "Everything all right, Officer Miller?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Miller cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the ID card. "Just verifying, Officer Beck," he replied, his tone clipped, defensive. Monroe's internal monologue churned. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, threatening to break through his carefully constructed composure. He suppressed it, breathing deeply, reminding himself of the battles he'd fought, the dignity he had always maintained. He would not allow this petty indignity to rob him of his peace. Suddenly, a staffer hurried towards them, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Justice Monroe," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "We were wondering where you were. The ceremony is about to begin." He glanced at the officers, his eyebrows raised in question. "Is there a problem?" The absurdity of the situation, the sheer incongruity of a retired Supreme Court justice being questioned in the halls of the very institution he helped shape, hung heavy in the air. Miller, caught off guard, stammered a response. "Just routine security, sir." The staffer's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Justice Monroe?" he repeated, as if confirming the obvious. He then turned to Miller, his voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. "You're detaining Justice Monroe?" Before Miller could respond, a figure emerged from a nearby doorway. Justice Clara Winslow, her face etched with quiet fury, strode towards them. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice ringing with authority. The scene unfolded with a dizzying speed. Explanations were offered, apologies stammered. Miller, his face now flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, attempted to justify his actions, his words stumbling over each other. Justice Winslow, unwavering in her defense of her friend and colleague, cut him short. Her words, precise and sharp, dissected his flimsy justifications. The staffer, efficient and professional, quickly rectified the situation, confirming Monroe's identity and ushering him towards the waiting ceremony. Officer Beck stood silently, her gaze fixed on the floor, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Later, in the quiet of his chambers, Assistant Director Raymond Lell of Capitol Police Internal Affairs reviewed the security footage, his expression grim. He listened to the recorded audio, his jaw tightening with each replay of Miller's words. He reviewed Beck's statement, noting the subtle yet damning observations she had made. The evidence was clear, irrefutable. The wheels of justice, slow but relentless, began to turn. As Monroe finally addressed the gathering, his voice resonated with a strength that transcended the earlier indignity. He spoke of the law, of its power to protect and its potential to oppress. He spoke of the insidious nature of prejudice, of the constant vigilance required to ensure that justice truly prevailed. His words, imbued with the weight of experience and the quiet fire of resolve, hung in the air, a testament to the enduring spirit of a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of a more perfect union. The incident, though unpleasant, became a footnote, a stark reminder of the battles still to be fought, the prejudices still to be overcome. And in the quiet aftermath, a seed of change was sown, a small but vital step towards a future where the halls of justice truly welcomed all. The fluorescent lights hummed, a constant, sterile drone against the marble stillness of the Supreme Court hallway. Ezekiel Monroe, his presence as imposing as the portraits of past justices lining the walls, felt a prickle of irritation beneath his carefully composed exterior. He presented his identification again, the retired justice card feeling strangely inadequate, almost insulting in this context. He had walked these halls for decades, a guardian of the very laws this young officer seemed so eager to misinterpret. Patience, Ezekiel, he told himself, the echo of his wife's voice a calming presence in his mind. This isn't worth your energy. But the tightness in his chest, the subtle clench of his jaw, betrayed the simmering anger beneath his placid surface. Officer Miller, his name tag gleaming under the harsh light, held the card between two fingers, his gaze flitting between the photo and Monroe's face. The subtle shift in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his lips, spoke volumes. Doubt, suspicion, the insidious whisper of prejudice. Monroe recognized it instantly, a familiar ghost from a past he thought he'd left behind. He'd seen that look before on the faces of classmates, colleagues, even fellow judges in his early years. It was a look that chipped away at your dignity, a look that questioned your right to simply be. "And what are you doing back here?" Miller asked, his voice echoing down the hallway. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Monroe's internal monologue sharpened. Back here? As if I don't belong. I'm attending a private ceremony, he replied, his voice level and controlled. He could feel the gaze of Officer Beck, the younger officer standing a few feet away, her silence a tangible weight. He sensed her discomfort, the internal struggle playing out behind her impassive expression. She knows this is wrong, he thought. But will she speak up? You were told to wait here in this hallway? Miller persisted, his tone laced with disbelief. He tapped the ID card against his palm, the rhythmic sound grating on Monroe's nerves. The hallway itself, a quiet corridor leading to the private chambers, was unremarkable. Yet, in Miller's eyes, it seemed to hold some sinister significance. Monroe could almost see the wheels turning in the officer's head, the assumptions piling up, fueled by prejudice and a need to exert his limited authority. He sees a black man in a suit and assumes the worst, Monroe thought, the bitterness rising like bile in his throat. Decades on the highest court and I'm still reduced to this. He explained again, patiently outlining the arrangements for the ceremony, the specific instructions he'd received. Each word was carefully chosen, measured, a testament to his years of legal precision. But Miller's expression remained unchanged, his skepticism etched into the lines around his eyes. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Monroe felt a surge of anger, a hot, burning wave that threatened to shatter his composure. He clenched his hands, forcing himself to breathe, to maintain the dignity that was his shield against this petty injustice. He would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken tensions. Monroe could feel Beck's gaze on him, a mixture of pity and apprehension. He knew she was caught in a difficult position, torn between her duty to follow orders and her own sense of right and wrong. He silently willed her to speak, to break the suffocating hold of Miller's prejudice. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway opened and a staffer emerged, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Justice Monroe?" he asked, his voice sharp and efficient. "Everything all right? Justice Winslow is waiting for you." He glanced at Miller, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Is there a problem?" The staffer's presence was a sudden shift in the dynamic. The air seemed to clear, the tension dissipating as quickly as it had arisen. Miller stammered, his carefully constructed facade of authority crumbling under the weight of the staffer's bewildered gaze. He explained, his words stumbling over each other, his earlier confidence replaced by a nervous uncertainty. The staffer listened, his expression growing increasingly incredulous. He looked at Monroe's ID, then back at Miller, his eyes conveying a mixture of disbelief and exasperation. "Officer, this is Justice Monroe," he said, his voice laced with a quiet authority that cut through Miller's blustering. "He's here for the ceremony." The staffer gestured towards the open door. "Please, Justice Monroe, this way." As Monroe walked past Miller, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The look on Miller's face, a mixture of confusion and dawning realization, was a small victory. But the sting of the injustice lingered, a reminder of the insidious nature of prejudice. Inside the room, Justice Winslow's embrace was warm and welcoming, a balm to the lingering anger. Her eyes, however, held a flicker of steel. "Ezekiel," she murmured, "are you all right?" He nodded, his voice still tight with suppressed emotion. He knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who faced this kind of humiliation every day. As he took his place for the ceremony, a new resolve hardened within him. He would use this experience, this blatant act of prejudice, to amplify his voice, to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. He wouldn't let this incident be swept under the rug. Justice, he knew, demanded more. The subsequent arrival of Assistant Director Raymond Lell from Internal Affairs, His brisk efficiency cutting through the remaining tension provided a sense of immediate, albeit insufficient, rectification. Officer Beck's visible discomfort and the palpable shift in Miller's demeanor spoke volumes. Yet Monroe's internal landscape remained turbulent. The initial wave of anger had subsided, replaced by a quiet resolve, a steely determination to address the larger issue at hand. The incident became a catalyst, not just for internal disciplinary action, but for a powerful statement delivered by Monroe at the very ceremony he was almost prevented from attending, a statement that resonated far beyond the marble walls of the Supreme Court. The marble of the Supreme Court building seemed to radiate a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Ezekiel Monroe felt it seep into his bones as he watched the young officer's face, a face tight with suspicion and something else, something colder. He'd seen that look before across courtrooms, across decades. He knew the subtle curl of the lip, the way the eyes narrowed, assessing not a person, but a threat. "I understand you're with Capitol Police, son," Monroe began, his voice a low rumble, carefully modulated. The same voice that had commanded attention in courtrooms for years. He handed over his identification again, his fingers brushing the officer's. He noted the slight flinch, the almost imperceptible withdrawal. Assumption, he thought, the word a bitter taste in his mouth. Prejudice wrapped in a uniform. "This just identifies you as Ezekiel Monroe," Officer Miller said. His tone clipped, almost dismissive. He flipped the ID card back and forth, as if expecting it to transform into something else, something more incriminating. The fluorescent lights glinted off his badge, momentarily blinding Monroe. He blinked, his patience, a carefully constructed edifice, beginning to crumble. The faint aroma of lemon polish, usually a comforting scent within these hallowed halls, now felt cloying, suffocating. He expects something different, Monroe realized. He expects a criminal. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. Officer Beck, standing slightly behind Miller, shifted her weight. Monroe could feel her gaze on him, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. He wondered if she recognized him, if she saw the absurdity of this situation. Or was she simply caught in the undertow of her partner's prejudice? Another bystander, he thought, a familiar weariness settling over him. Another witness to the casual indignities. "And what other credentials would satisfy you, officer?" Monroe asked, the question hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He forced himself to keep his voice even, to resist the urge to unleash the full force of his displeasure. Not here, he told himself. Not now. He could feel the hum of activity around them, the muffled footsteps of staffers hurrying past. He imagined their curious glances, their whispered speculations. The thought fueled his anger, a slow burn beneath his controlled exterior. Miller's jaw tightened. "Sir, this is a private event. I need to see your invitation, your access badge, something that proves you're supposed to be here." He held out his hand, palm up, a gesture that felt less like a request and more like a demand. He enjoys this, Monroe realized, the thought chilling him. He enjoys the power, the control. He could practically taste the officer's self-satisfaction. "Son, I've been answering questions for longer than you've been alive," Monroe stated, his voice finally betraying a hint of steel. "But right now, what you're doing, it's not procedure. It's assumption." The words hung in the air, stark and accusatory. He saw Miller's face flush, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had struck a nerve. "Sir, I'm just doing my job," Miller retorted, his voice rising slightly. "I need to verify your identity." He took a step closer, his hand hovering near his holster. The subtle movement didn't escape Monroe's notice. His heart pounded a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He feels challenged, he realized, the understanding bringing a strange sense of clarity. My defiance is a threat to his authority. "My identity is not in question, officer," Monroe replied, his voice now laced with ice. He felt a tremor of anger run through him, a cold, hard fury he hadn't felt in years. He resisted the urge to reach out, to grab the officer's arm, to shake some sense into him. Control, he reminded himself. Maintain control. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, I'll have to detain you," Miller said, his hand now resting on his holster. He puffed out his chest, a display of dominance that felt almost comical. Monroe closed his eyes for a moment, drawing a deep breath, willing himself to remain calm. The scent of lemon polish was now overpowering, nauseating. This is happening, he thought, the realization settling over him like a shroud. This is really happening. He opened his eyes and met Miller's gaze, a silent battle of wills. He could feel Officer Beck's eyes on them, a silent plea in her gaze. But it was too late. The gears were in motion, the machinery of prejudice grinding inexorably forward. "Officer." A new voice cut through the tense standoff. It was a young staffer, his face pale, his eyes wide with alarm. "Justice Winslow is looking for Justice Monroe. The ceremony is about to begin." He glanced nervously between Miller and Monroe, his discomfort palpable. Miller's face paled. He looked from the staffer to Monroe, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. He stammered, "Justice Monroe." The question hung in the air, a testament to the absurdity of the situation. "Yes, officer," Monroe replied, his voice heavy with weariness. "Justice Monroe. I believe I mentioned that." Justice Winslow appeared then, her expression a thundercloud. "Ezekiel," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "What is the meaning of this?" Her gaze shifted to Miller, her eyes narrowing. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The fluorescent lights of the Supreme Court building hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the rising tension. Ezekiel Monroe, his distinguished face etched with disbelief, stood frozen. The polished marble floor reflected the stark reality of the situation, a retired Supreme Court justice, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, now facing the indignity of being treated like a common criminal. He felt a chilling premonition, a sense of unreality that prickled his skin like ice water. This couldn't be happening, not here, not to him. Yet, the steely glint in Officer Miller's eyes confirmed the absurdity unfolding before him. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Miller's voice was flat, devoid of any inflection that might suggest doubt or hesitation. It was a command delivered with the rote certainty of one accustomed to unquestioned obedience. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, surged through Monroe. He clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face tightening. His mind raced, trying to grasp the sheer illogicality of it all. He'd shown his identification, explained his presence. What more could this officer possibly want? This wasn't about security. It was something else, something darker, something that twisted in his gut like a poisoned seed. He could feel the weight of every prejudice gaze he'd encountered throughout his life, culminating in this single, humiliating moment. "I just showed you my ID," Monroe stated, his voice controlled, each word a carefully placed stone in a crumbling wall of reason. "You didn't even check with anyone. You just decided." The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, thick with the unspoken history of racial profiling. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this wasn't about a forgotten guest list. This was about the color of his skin. Beside Miller, the younger officer, Beck, shifted uneasily. She avoided Monroe's gaze, her eyes flicking nervously between Miller and the retired justice. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face, a brief ripple in the otherwise placid surface of her professionalism. She could feel the tension radiating off Monroe, the palpable sense of injustice that hung heavy in the air. Her training screamed at her to obey, to follow Miller's lead, but a quiet voice of dissent whispered in her ear, questioning the righteousness of the situation. What if it were her grandfather standing there, facing such blatant disrespect? The thought made her stomach churn. Miller's grip tightened on his baton, his knuckles white against the dark leather. He sensed Beck's hesitation, the subtle shift in her posture, and it fueled his own rigid stance. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not in front of a rookie. He needed to maintain control, to assert his authority, even if the foundation of that authority was built on the shifting sands of prejudice. He saw the flicker of defiance in Monroe's eyes, the refusal to submit, and it only strengthened his resolve. "I said, hands behind your back," Miller repeated, his voice harder this time, edged with a threat. He took a step closer, invading Monroe's personal space, the silent language of power and intimidation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the marble floor, turning the scene into a grotesque tableau. Monroe held his ground. He refused to turn around. To comply would be to concede, to accept the injustice, to become another statistic in a system rigged against him. He would not break. He would not bend. He would stand tall, even in the face of this unwarranted aggression. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating with unspoken accusations and simmering rage. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the legacy of countless others who had endured similar indignities. He would not be another silent victim. Miller's patience snapped. With a swift, brutal movement, he grabbed Monroe's arm, twisting it behind his back. A sharp cry of pain escaped Monroe's lips, a sound that echoed in the sterile hallway, a stark testament to the violence of the moment. The metallic click of handcuffs followed, a final, humiliating punctuation mark to the scene. Beck flinched, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to speak, to intervene, but the words were trapped in her throat, choked by the fear of challenging authority. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She knew this was wrong, deeply wrong, but the ingrained obedience, the fear of repercussions, paralyzed her. The image of Monroe, his face etched with pain and disbelief, seared itself into her memory. She knew she would never forget this moment, the moment she stood by and watched injustice unfold. A door opened down the hall, and a staffer emerged, his face a mask of confusion. He took in the scene, the retired justice in handcuffs, the two officers flanking him, the palpable tension in the air, and his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to outrage. He knew Justice Monroe, recognized him instantly. He'd been working at the court for years and had seen Monroe preside over countless cases, a beacon of justice and integrity. This was an outrage, a travesty. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice sharp with authority. He strode towards them, his steps echoing in the suddenly silent hallway. Miller's face flushed, a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He stammered, trying to explain, to justify his actions, but the words tangled in his throat. He knew he'd overstepped, that he'd let his prejudice cloud his judgment. Before Miller could formulate a coherent response, another figure appeared, her presence radiating authority and quiet fury. Justice Clara Winslow, her face set in a grim mask, surveyed the scene. Her eyes met Monroe's, and a flicker of shared understanding passed between them. "Release him," she commanded, her voice low and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. The staffer quickly unlocked the handcuffs, his hands trembling slightly. Monroe rubbed his wrists, the metal leaving a stinging imprint on his skin, a physical reminder of the indignity he'd endured. Later, after Assistant Director Raymond Lell of Capitol Police Internal Affairs arrived, cutting through red tape and bureaucratic obfuscation with the swift efficiency of a surgeon's scalpel, Miller and Beck found themselves facing disciplinary action. Justice Winslow, her voice resonating with quiet power, ensured that the incident was thoroughly investigated. And finally, standing at the podium, addressing the gathering he was meant to attend hours earlier, Ezekiel Monroe spoke not only of constitutional law but of the insidious poison of prejudice that still permeated the halls of justice, the very institution he had dedicated his life to serving. His words, measured and resonant, hung in the air, a stark reminder of the long road still ahead. The fluorescent lights of the small, windowless room hummed a monotonous tune, reflecting off the sterile white walls. Ezekiel Monroe sat on the hard plastic chair, the cuffs digging into his wrists, a cold pressure against his skin. He felt a flicker of something akin to disbelief, a strange detachment from the absurdity of the situation. He, Ezekiel Monroe, retired justice of the Supreme Court, detained like a common criminal in the very building where he'd spent decades upholding the law. The irony wasn't lost on him, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He could almost hear the echo of his own pronouncements, the weight of his gavel, the rustle of robes in the hallowed halls just beyond these walls. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on controlling his breathing, a technique he'd learned years ago to manage the pressure of high-stakes cases. This, however, was a different kind of pressure, a personal affront that burrowed under his skin. Officer Miller stood by the door, his posture rigid, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. The younger officer, Beck, shifted uneasily from foot to foot, her gaze darting between Miller and Monroe. She avoided Monroe's eyes, her own reflecting a disquiet that mirrored his own inner turmoil. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the lights and the faint, distant clatter of activity from beyond the room. Monroe could practically feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken assumptions hanging heavy in the air. He refused to meet their eyes, focusing instead on a small scuff mark on the floor, a tiny imperfection in the otherwise pristine surface. He'd always been a man of details, finding solace in the minutiae, a way to anchor himself in the present moment. He needed that anchor now, a focal point to prevent the rising tide of anger from consuming him. The door opened, interrupting the tense tableau. A young clerk, his face pale and etched with surprise, hurried in, clutching a file to his chest. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Justice Monroe, handcuffed, flanked by 2 Capitol Police officers. The file slipped from his grasp, scattering papers across the floor. The sound, sharp and unexpected, seemed to break the spell that had held the room captive. "Wait," the clerk stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Judge Monroe." Miller stepped forward, his voice laced with a condescending tone. "Everything's under control here, son. Just go about your business." Monroe raised his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. The clerk's recognition, the flicker of shock and disbelief in his eyes, was a small victory, a tiny crack in the wall of indifference that Miller had erected. "Tell Justice Winslow," Monroe said, his voice calm despite the simmering anger beneath the surface. "I won't make it on time." He forced himself to maintain eye contact with the clerk, ignoring the triumphant smirk that spread across Miller's face. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort, his humiliation. The clerk's face paled further. He scrambled to gather the scattered papers, his hands trembling. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers clumsy as he dialed a number. Monroe watched him, a strange mix of emotions churning within him. Shame, anger, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He'd fought for justice his entire life, only to be subjected to this blatant injustice, this casual disregard for his dignity, his personhood. The thought stung, a sharp, piercing pain that resonated deep within his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself against the wave of despair that threatened to engulf him. The clerk spoke in hushed tones, relaying the situation to Justice Winslow's office. Monroe could hear snippets of the conversation, the disbelief in the voice on the other end, the rising urgency, the sharp, clipped questions. He opened his eyes again, focusing on the clerk's face, searching for any sign of hope. He found it in the clerk's determined nod, the subtle straightening of his spine, the newfound firmness in his voice. A small spark of hope flickered within Monroe's chest, a fragile ember in the face of the storm. He knew Winslow. She wouldn't stand for this. She wouldn't let this injustice stand. Miller's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of unease. He shifted his weight, his hand instinctively moving towards his holster. Beck, her face pale, continued to avoid Monroe's gaze, her internal struggle evident in the tight set of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands. The silence returned, heavier now, pregnant with anticipation. The hum of the lights seemed to intensify, a buzzing in the air that mirrored the tension in the room. The clerk disconnected the call, his face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Justice Winslow is on her way," he said, his voice steadier now, a hint of defiance in his tone. He met Monroe's gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the shared outrage, the shared understanding of the absurdity of the situation. He didn't offer an apology, knowing that words were inadequate in the face of such a blatant violation. Instead, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of solidarity, a promise of rectification. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in the room. Miller's unease grew, his bravado slowly eroding under the weight of the impending confrontation. Beck's discomfort intensified, her eyes darting towards the door, her body language screaming her desire to escape the confines of the small, oppressive room. Monroe sat still, his hands still cuffed, his body aching from the rigid posture, but his mind sharp, his resolve unwavering. He would face Winslow with his head held high, his dignity intact. He would not let this incident break him. He would use it as a testament to the insidious nature of prejudice, a reminder that even in the highest echelons of power, injustice could still prevail. He would turn this humiliation into a platform, a springboard for change. The door swung open, and Justice Clara Winslow strode into the room, her face a mask of controlled fury. The air crackled with her presence, the temperature in the room seeming to drop several degrees. The game had changed. The hunter had become the hunted. The sterile white walls of the side room seemed to amplify the silence, a silence thick with unspoken tension. Ezekiel Monroe stood with his hands cuffed behind him, the cold metal a stark contrast against the warmth of his skin. He could feel the phantom pressure of Miller's hand on his arm, the indignity of the forced restraint burning hotter than any physical discomfort. His gaze, usually filled with the measured wisdom of decades spent interpreting law, now held a glacial calm. Inwardly, a storm raged. He'd faced down hostile witnesses, dissected complex legal arguments, and even endured the sting of public criticism, but this casual disregard, this presumption of guilt based solely on the color of his skin, was a different kind of battle. It chipped away at the very foundation of his being, the years of striving for justice mocked by this petty display of prejudice. Miller, oblivious to the turmoil he'd unleashed, stood a few feet away, his posture rigid, his face a mask of self-satisfied authority. He adjusted his belt, the small, repetitive gesture betraying a nervous energy that belied his outward composure. He hadn't expected any resistance, hadn't considered for a moment that the man he'd so readily profiled could be someone of consequence. A flicker of doubt, a fleeting thought of the potential ramifications of his actions, crossed his mind, quickly suppressed by a stubborn refusal to acknowledge his error. He was just doing his job, he told himself, keeping things secure. Beck shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, her eyes darting between Monroe and Miller. The silence in the small room pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. Her training had emphasized procedure, following orders, maintaining the chain of command, but something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. She could see the quiet dignity in Monroe's posture, the controlled anger in the depths of his eyes, and it clashed jarringly with Miller's aggressive certainty. Say something, a small voice urged within her. Do something. But the weight of authority, the ingrained fear of stepping out of line, held her captive. The sudden, sharp click of the door opening broke the strained silence. A man strode in, his face flushed with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He took in the scene: Monroe, handcuffed, Miller standing guard, Beck looking like a trapped animal, and his already simmering anger boiled over. "Who authorized this?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the confined space. He moved with a brisk efficiency, his gaze fixed on Miller, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of his scrutiny. Miller stammered, "Sir, this individual." The staffer cut him off, his words sharp and precise. "This is Monroe, Judge Ezekiel Monroe. Retired Supreme Court Justice Monroe. He's here for the Winslow reception." "What the hell are you doing?" The staffer's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implication. The recognition of Monroe's identity was a physical blow, knocking the air out of Miller's lungs. His face paled, the bravado draining away, leaving behind a stark, naked fear. He'd made a mistake, a colossal, career-ending mistake. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in a sea of regret. Beck felt a wave of relief wash over her, mixed with a lingering sense of shame. She should have spoken up sooner, should have challenged Miller's actions. Her silence had made her complicit, a small cog in the machine of injustice. She looked at Monroe, a silent apology in her eyes. The staffer, his initial fury now replaced by a grim determination, quickly unlocked the handcuffs. "Justice Monroe, I am deeply sorry for this egregious error. This should never have happened." He spoke with the practiced sincerity of someone accustomed to navigating delicate situations, but beneath the smooth veneer, Monroe could sense a genuine remorse. Monroe rubbed his wrists, the ghost of the restraints still lingering. He met the staffer's gaze, his own eyes holding a depth of emotion that spoke volumes. "This incident," he said, his voice low and steady, "is not simply an error. It's a symptom of a deeper sickness, a sickness that infects our institutions and poisons our society." His words, though spoken quietly, resonated with the power of his long and distinguished career. As Monroe was led away, escorted now with deference and apologies, Miller stood rooted to the spot, the staffer's earlier words ringing in his ears. "Career-ending mistake." He could feel the sweat trickling down his spine, the cold dread settling in his stomach. He had acted on impulse, on ingrained prejudice, and now he was facing the consequences. Beck, still grappling with her own complicity, watched Miller's collapse with a mixture of pity and revulsion. She understood the pressure to conform, the fear of challenging authority, but she also knew that silence could be a form of consent. This incident, she realized, would forever be etched in her memory, a stark reminder of the choices she had, and the choices she would make in the future. Moments later, Justice Clara Winslow, a whirlwind of controlled fury, entered the side room, her eyes blazing. The staffer tried to explain, to apologize, but Winslow cut him short. She demanded answers, demanded accountability, her voice ringing with the authority of her position. Her concern for her friend and colleague was palpable, fueled by a righteous anger that transcended personal feelings. This was not just about Ezekiel Monroe. It was about the insidious nature of prejudice, the casual disregard for human dignity that still permeated even the highest halls of justice. Assistant Director Raymond Lell arrived, his face grim, his presence radiating authority. He took in the scene, listened to the staffer's hurried explanation, and then turned his attention to Miller and Beck. His questions were sharp, precise, cutting through the layers of excuses and justifications. He understood the complexities of the situation, the nuances of power and prejudice, and he was determined to ensure that justice, in all its forms, would be served. The wheels of internal affairs were already turning, grinding slowly but inexorably towards a reckoning. Later that evening, at the very reception he had been unjustly prevented from attending, Justice Monroe stood before a hushed crowd. The incident had preceded him, a ripple of unease and outrage spreading through the assembled guests. He spoke not of his own experience, but of the larger issue, the systemic bias that continued to plague the nation. His words, measured and resonant, held the weight of his lived experience, a powerful testament to the enduring struggle for equality and justice. The silence in the room was different now, no longer thick with tension, but filled with a shared understanding, a collective commitment to change. The heavy oak door of Justice Winslow's chambers closed with a soft, yet definitive click, a sound that echoed the finality of the preceding events. The air within the room, usually imbued with the quiet hum of legal discourse, was thick with unspoken tension. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting stripes of warmth across the rich Persian rug, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled between the two figures within. Clara Winslow, her face etched with a weariness that belied her usual sharp composure, poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. The clinking of the glass against the crystal felt overly loud in the strained silence. She offered one to Ezekiel Monroe, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. He accepted it, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of the shared discomfort. He took a slow sip, the burn of the aged scotch a stark contrast to the icy knot in his stomach. Ezekiel, Winslow began, her voice barely above a whisper, each syllable laden with a weight of apology. I am so profoundly sorry for what happened. I can't, she trailed off, shaking her head, her carefully constructed facade of judicial impartiality crumbling under the weight of her personal outrage. The image of Monroe, a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, standing handcuffed in the halls of the very institution he had served, seared itself onto the back of her eyelids. It was a betrayal, a perversion of everything they both believed in. Monroe took another sip of his drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, mirroring the turmoil of emotions within him. He could still feel the cold steel of the handcuffs against his wrists, a physical reminder of the indignity he had suffered. The casual arrogance in Officer Miller's eyes, the blatant disregard for his words, the presumption of guilt based solely on the color of his skin, it all replayed in his mind like a broken record. Yet, strangely, the dominant emotion wasn't rage, but a profound weariness. A weariness born not just from this single incident, but from a lifetime of navigating a system that often seemed designed to impede his progress, to question his worth. Clara, he finally said, his voice low and steady. Your apologies are misplaced. This isn't about you. This is about a sickness that has infected our institutions for far too long. Winslow looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and admiration. She had always respected Monroe's quiet strength, his unwavering commitment to principle. But what can we do? She asked, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. Miller will be disciplined, of course, but disciplined, Monroe echoed, a faint trace of bitterness coloring his tone. A slap on the wrist, a transfer, perhaps? Will that erase the humiliation? Will it change the mindset that led to this in the first place? He paused, staring into the depths of his glass, as if searching for answers within the swirling liquid. No, Clara, he continued, his voice gaining strength. This isn't about retribution. This is about using this unfortunate incident as a catalyst for change. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, the fire of conviction burning bright in his eyes. I'm going to make this right. Winslow, caught off guard by the steely resolve in his voice, frowned slightly. What do you mean? She asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in her chest. She knew Monroe. When he spoke of making things right, it wasn't about personal vengeance. It was about something far larger, far more profound. Monroe set his glass down on the polished mahogany table, the soft thud echoing the finality of his decision. The event, he said, his voice unwavering. The ceremony, I'm still going. Winslow's eyes widened in surprise. But Ezekiel, she protested, her voice laced with concern. After what happened, are you sure? You don't have to. We can postpone it. Reschedule. He raised a hand, silencing her objections. He knew she meant well, that her concern stemmed from genuine care. But he also knew that backing down now would be a betrayal of everything he stood for. No, he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power that filled the room. I want them to hear it. Every single one of them. He thought of the carefully crafted speech he had prepared. The words meant to inspire hope, to celebrate the progress made, to acknowledge the challenges that remained. Now, those words would carry a different weight, a deeper meaning. They would be imbued with the raw emotion of his recent experience, a testament to the enduring struggle for equality. He would not let Miller's prejudice silence him. He would use this incident as a platform, a springboard to ignite a much-needed conversation. Winslow stared at him for a long moment, her initial concern slowly giving way to a grudging admiration. She knew there was no dissuading him. The quiet fire in his eyes, the unwavering resolve in his voice, told her that his decision was irrevocable. She drew a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle that lay ahead. All right, she said, her voice firm, though a tremor of anxiety still lingered beneath the surface. All right, Ezekiel. I'll stand with you. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air between them, a shared understanding of the magnitude of the task they had set for themselves. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, with resistance from those who preferred to maintain the status quo. But in that moment, united by a shared purpose, they were ready to face it. The faint scent of scotch lingered in the air, a bittersweet reminder of the injustice that had brought them to this point, and a silent promise of the fight that was yet to come. The crystal chandeliers, a constellation of light against the darkened mahogany, cast long shadows across the polished marble floor. A hushed reverence settled over the chamber, the air thick with anticipation. Ezekiel Monroe stood at the podium, his tall frame ramrod straight, his face a mask of composed dignity. The events of the morning, the raw humiliation of being handcuffed in the very halls where he had dispensed justice for decades, still burned in his chest like a swallowed ember. He felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, some curious, some sympathetic, some perhaps even harboring the same insidious prejudice that had led to his detainment. He adjusted the microphone, the faint metallic click echoing in the sudden stillness. He could feel the ghost of the handcuffs on his wrists, a phantom weight reminding him of the absurdity, the injustice. In this hallowed hall, where the scales of justice are meant to be balanced, I was weighed and found wanting, he thought, the bitterness rising in his throat. He took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying himself. He had not come here to recount his personal grievance, but to expose a deeper wound, a systemic infection that threatened the very foundations of the institution. He began to speak, his voice low and resonant, each word carefully chosen, each syllable imbued with the weight of his experience. I stand before you tonight, not merely as a retired justice of this esteemed court, but as a citizen, a man who has dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice and equality under the law. The words felt hollow even to his own ears, tainted by the morning's events. Equality, justice, the irony twisted in his gut. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, a pregnant pause filled with unspoken meaning. He could see Clara in the front row, her face a mixture of anger and concern. He knew she had been instrumental in arranging this address, in giving him this platform. He owed it to her, to himself, to every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character, to speak the truth. This morning, he continued, his voice gaining strength, I was mistaken for a trespasser, cuffed, detained because the young man in uniform didn't know who I was and didn't bother to ask. The murmur that rippled through the room was like a sigh, a collective intake of breath. He saw a flicker of unease in the faces of some of his former colleagues, a tightening of lips, a subtle aversion of gaze. He understood their discomfort. This was not polite dinner conversation. This was a raw, festering wound laid bare for all to see. They would prefer to ignore it, to pretend it doesn't exist, he thought, his gaze sweeping across the room. But I will not let them. He spoke of the casual indifference of the officer, the way he had looked through him, not at him. He described the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, the feeling of powerlessness, of being reduced to nothing more than a suspect, a potential threat. He didn't raise his voice, didn't resort to histrionics. The quiet power of his words, the stark honesty of his account, was far more effective than any outburst of anger could have been. He recounted the internal struggle, the battle between maintaining his composure and succumbing to the rage that threatened to consume him. He spoke of the shame not for himself, but for the system that allowed such an injustice to occur within its own hallowed halls. I have spent my life upholding the principles of justice, of fairness, of equality before the law. His voice resonated, filling the chamber. But this morning, I was confronted with the harsh reality that those principles, for some, remain elusive, a distant dream rather than a lived experience. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, to take root in the silence. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the collective unease growing, morphing into something else, something akin to understanding, to recognition. He spoke of the insidious nature of implicit bias, the unconscious prejudices that shape our perceptions and influence our actions. He challenged his audience, his former colleagues, to examine their own biases, to confront the uncomfortable truths that lay hidden beneath the surface of polite society. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, the collective responsibility to dismantle the structures of systemic racism that permeated every facet of their lives. It is not enough to simply condemn such acts when they occur, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. We must actively work to eradicate the underlying prejudices that fuel them. He could feel a surge of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. Perhaps, just perhaps, his words would make a difference. Perhaps this incident, this personal humiliation, could be a catalyst for change. It has to be, he thought, clenching his hands at the podium, the phantom weight of the handcuffs a constant reminder of the work that still needed to be done. He concluded his speech with a call to action, a plea for unity, for a collective commitment to building a more just and equitable society. As he stepped back from the podium, the silence held for a moment, a heavy, pregnant silence charged with emotion. Then, a single person began to applaud, then another and another, until the chamber erupted in a thunderous ovation. A wave of sound that washed over him, a tangible expression of support, of solidarity. He stood there, bathed in the applause, a sense of weary satisfaction settling over him. The fight was far from over, but for tonight, at least, he had spoken his truth, and he had been heard. He glanced at Clara, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a small, proud smile playing on her lips. It was a small victory, a single step on a long and arduous journey, but it was a start. And in the fight for justice, every step counted. The stale air hung heavy in the small conference room, the faint hum of fluorescent lights a monotonous backdrop to the tension that crackled in the air. Officer Hannah Beck sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the starched fabric of her uniform suddenly feeling abrasive against her skin. Across the table, Officer Travis Miller leaned back in his chair, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips. He tapped a rhythmic beat on the table with his fingers, a counterpoint to the frantic drumbeat in Beck's chest. He's not even worried, she thought, her stomach churning. He doesn't even understand. Assistant Director Raymond Lell entered, his presence filling the cramped space with an almost palpable weight of authority. He carried a thin file, its contents the embodiment of the storm brewing inside Beck. Lell sat down, his gaze sharp and unwavering as he addressed the two officers. Officer Miller, Officer Beck. We're here today to discuss the incident involving retired Justice Ezekiel Monroe. He opened the file, the crisp sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. Miller's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. This is a waste of time, Beck could practically hear him thinking. They'll let me off with a warning. But Beck knew, with a sinking certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was far more serious. She replayed the events of the evening in her mind, each moment a fresh stab of guilt. She had stood by, frozen by indecision, while Miller had handcuffed Justice Monroe, a man whose name resonated with legal history, a man whose very presence commanded respect. The injustice of it clawed at her conscience. She had sworn an oath to protect, to serve, but her silence had made her complicit in Miller's blatant act of racial profiling. You had no reason to detain Justice Monroe. Lell's voice cut through the silence, each word precise and weighted with disapproval. He presented his identification, explained his presence at a private event, and yet you chose to escalate the situation. Miller shifted in his chair, the arrogance returning to his posture. He fit the description, he muttered, the words a flimsy shield against the accusation hanging in the air. Lell's eyes narrowed. The description? A black man in a suit? Officer Miller, this is the Supreme Court, not a back alley. You should be familiar with the individuals who frequent this building, especially those who have served on the highest court in the land. A flush crept up Miller's neck, the first visible crack in his carefully constructed facade of indifference. Beck could practically taste the bitter tang of his humiliation. He's embarrassed, she realized, a flicker of something akin to satisfaction momentarily eclipsing her own anxiety. But embarrassment isn't enough. Lell continued, his voice even, but laced with steel. Officer Beck, you witnessed this incident. You saw the injustice unfolding before your eyes. Why did you not intervene? Beck swallowed, her throat dry. The words caught in her throat, a tangled mess of fear and regret. I was following orders, she stammered, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Following orders is not a blanket excuse for inaction, Officer Beck, Lel replied, his gaze piercing. You have a duty to uphold the law, not to blindly obey prejudiced commands. Your silence speaks volumes. His words hit their mark, leaving Beck feeling exposed and ashamed. He's right, she thought, the weight of her inaction pressing down on her. I should have spoken up. I could have stopped it. Lel addressed them both. What now is consequences? What now is accountability? And what now is public? He paused, letting the weight of his questions settle in the room. Officer Beck, you will receive a formal reprimand. This will be noted on your record. I expect better from you in the future. You are young in your career, but this is a steep learning curve. Do not fail to learn from it. Beck nodded, relief washing over her, tinged with the bitter taste of shame. She had escaped the worst of it, but the scar of this incident would remain. Lel turned his attention back to Miller. Officer Miller, your actions demonstrate a clear bias, a blatant disregard for protocol, and a profound lack of judgment. Your behavior has brought discredit upon the Capitol Police and undermined the very principles of justice we are sworn to uphold. He closed the file, the sound final and irrevocable. You are suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Further disciplinary action, including termination, is likely. The blood drained from Miller's face, leaving him ashen. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization of the consequences finally hit him, shattering his illusion of invincibility. He's lost everything, Beck thought, a shiver running down her spine, and it's all his own fault. The door opened, and a staffer entered, informing Lel that the ceremony honoring Justice Monroe was about to begin. Lel nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He rose, his gaze sweeping over the two officers one last time. This incident should serve as a stark reminder, he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. Justice is blind, but we are not. We must strive to see beyond our prejudices, to uphold the law with fairness and integrity, and to ensure that incidents like this never happen again. He left, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Beck and Miller sat in silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights amplifying the emptiness of the room. The consequences had been delivered, the lines drawn. For Beck, it was a chance to learn, to grow, to become a better officer. For Miller, it was the end of the road, a bitter testament to the destructive power of prejudice. Later that evening, Beck watched the news coverage of the ceremony. Justice Monroe, dignified and composed, delivered a powerful speech about the enduring struggle for equality and justice. His words resonated deeply with Beck, echoing the lesson she had learned so painfully that day. Justice Monroe had faced injustice with grace and resilience. He had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a call for systemic change. The camera panned to Justice Winslow, her expression a mixture of pride and quiet anger. She had stood by her friend, her unwavering support a beacon of hope in the face of adversity. Beck knew, with a newfound clarity, that this was the kind of officer she wanted to be, someone who stood for justice, someone who spoke truth to power, someone who refused to be silent in the face of wrong. The road ahead was long, but Beck was ready to walk it. She had learned a valuable lesson, a lesson etched in the stark reality of the conference room and illuminated by the unwavering dignity of Justice Ezekiel Monroe. The cool marble of the wall pressed against Ezekiel Monroe's back, a stark contrast to the heat still simmering beneath his skin. The hallway outside Justice Winslow's chambers, usually a hushed corridor of power, felt charged, the air thick with unspoken words. He closed his eyes, the image of Miller's hand on his arm, the biting steel of the handcuffs, flashing behind his eyelids. The indignity of it, the absurdity, gnawed at him. He, Ezekiel Monroe, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, treated like a common criminal in the very halls of justice. He had felt a strange detachment during the ordeal, a sense of observing himself from a distance, as if his body were merely a vessel weathering the storm. But now, the storm had passed, leaving behind a chilling stillness, a quiet fury that settled deep in his bones. Clara Winslow's hand on his shoulder brought him back to the present. He opened his eyes to meet her steady gaze, the shared history between them, the battles fought and victories won, etched into the lines around her eyes. "Still your house, Zeke?" she said, her voice low and firm. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Is it, Clara? Is it really?" "It is," she insisted, her grip tightening on his shoulder. "But every house has a foundation, and sometimes it takes a crack to see just how deep it runs." Her words resonated with a disquieting truth. The incident with Miller wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom, a manifestation of something far more pervasive, a crack that revealed the rot beneath the polished surface. He'd seen it before, throughout his career, subtle biases and veiled prejudices seeping into the very fabric of the system he had sworn to protect. He'd fought against it in the courtroom, with carefully crafted arguments and reasoned judgments. But this time it was personal. This time he wasn't just a judge, a detached arbiter of justice. He was the victim, the accused, the other. The realization struck him with a profound sadness, a weariness that settled deep in his soul. Later, when he finally stood before the assembled guests, the incident with Miller felt like a distant echo, a phantom limb. He looked out at the sea of faces, expectant, hopeful. He had prepared a speech about the future of law, about the responsibility that rested on the shoulders of the next generation of legal minds. But the words felt hollow, inadequate. He cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying the silence in the room. He spoke not of the future, but of the present, of the cracks in the foundation, the unseen biases that continued to plague the very halls of justice. He spoke of his own experience, the raw humiliation, the quiet rage, the chilling realization that even within these hallowed walls, prejudice could flourish. His words, unscripted, unfiltered, poured out, carrying the weight of his years, the burden of his experience. He spoke not as a retired justice, but as a black man in America, a man who had seen firsthand the insidious nature of systemic bias. His voice, steady and resonant, filled the room, each word a hammer blow against the wall of complacency. The silence that followed his speech was heavy, pregnant with unspoken truths. Then, a slow, sustained applause erupted, rippling through the room, a wave of acknowledgement, a shared understanding. In the following days and weeks, Monroe's speech reverberated beyond the walls of the Supreme Court. Shared across social media platforms, it became a viral phenomenon, sparking conversations, igniting debates, forcing a nation to confront its uncomfortable truths. The Capitol Police launched an internal investigation. Officer Beck, haunted by her inaction, requested a transfer to community outreach, seeking a way to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. She carried the weight of that afternoon, the memory of Monroe's handcuffed wrists, a constant reminder of the choices she had made, and the choices she would make in the future. Miller, facing mounting pressure, was placed on administrative leave, the future of his career uncertain. He spent his days in a haze of disbelief, unable to comprehend the fallout from what he perceived as a simple procedure, a misunderstanding. He grappled with the consequences of his actions, the public condemnation, the erosion of his self-image. He saw his reflection in the unforgiving lens of social media, a symbol of systemic prejudice, a villain in a narrative he never intended to write. Justice Winslow, in a rare public statement, issued a formal apology to Justice Monroe, acknowledging the systemic failures that had led to the incident. Her words, carefully chosen, reflected not only her personal regret, but also her commitment to addressing the underlying issues within the institution she represented. Months later, Ezekiel Monroe stood before another audience, this time a gathering of law students, their faces eager, their eyes bright with the promise of a future in law. He looked out at them, at the diverse tapestry of faces, and he spoke not of the past, but of the future. "Don't spend your whole career trying to prove you belong," he said, his voice resonating with the weight of his experience. Spend it making sure others don't get pushed out just because they don't look like they do. His words, imbued with the wisdom of a life dedicated to justice, hung in the air, a challenge, a call to action, a seed of hope planted in the fertile ground of the next generation. The ripple effect of that single afternoon in the Supreme Court continued to spread. Its impact felt far beyond the marble halls of justice, a testament to the enduring power of one man's voice, a single crack in the foundation, and the unwavering pursuit of a more just and equitable future.